he's made a handout on top of a PowerPoint presentation, so why not? And, so you don't have to write all the names, because I'm afraid there will be a lot of mentioning names, and sometimes it's better to have them written out.
Does everyone have the handout?
So, I went wrong.
Well, this is our second paper by someone whom you know as well as I do, by Marie-Claire Phelippeau. And among her many other laurels is the time that she spent as editor of Moriana. And she has published several books on Thomas More, including a biography which has been translated into Slovenian, and will probably be translated into other languages, knowing the quality of her work. She also published her dissertation on heaven and related materials in Thomas More. And she's been presenting papers all over the world. In her latest incarnation or reincarnation, I would call her a world ambassador for Thomas More, and particularly bringing together scholars from everywhere with a focus, in a sense, on everywhere but the United States, which is not an omission, but because the Catholic University at the University of Dallas has a center for Thomas More studies. And they are very much focused, I would say, primarily on North America. And Travis Curtright is now the editor of Moriana, and he is tied in with the University of Dallas, that center, which is, at least in the next few years, funding the publication of the journal, Moriana. So Marie-Claire and her husband have now undertaken this really wonderfully exciting venture of linking all of us and remembering all the different countries. And originally I was, as I said earlier, I was going to congratulate Marie-Claire and everyone, because here we were with 3 speakers from such different places. We're still here with 2 speakers from different places. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce or reintroduce someone you know well, Marie-Claire Phelippeau. And she is going to speak about history's judgment of Thomas More through fiction.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. This is a very generous presentation indeed. And of course, yes, we do enjoy what we're doing. It's never been a chore, believe me. It's always been a very great pleasure to have you all respond so warmly to our convening you, if I may say so. Okay, so I've been very ambitious in this particular paper because I'm in love with the history of mentalities that has been retitled History of Representation by Paul Ricoeur and Cultural History by most English speakers. And so I like to see the evolution of how an idea goes through life, through history, and how Thomas More goes through history. And through history in fiction, because that is a popular judgment. So now I'm going to read this, because if I start talking, instead of reading, we'll be there in 2 hours' time. So my intention in this study is to draw a quick panorama of how Thomas More was represented in fiction from the time of his death until today, and try to see the evolution of the perception of his persona. This study does not consider the work of historians, but focuses on fiction only, historical novels and drama mainly, in an attempt to catch the popular judgment of the historical Thomas More at various times and in different backgrounds. Of course, no research of that nature can pretend to be exhaustive, and much less this sketchy attempt. However, I hope it may open some new lines of inquiry, as I discovered interesting research leads that still await consideration. We might talk about that, like, for example, how can we picture Margaret Roper around the centuries, or Thomas Cromwell? That would be a very interesting lead indeed. When in the 1980s, Friedrich Unterweg listed the theatre plays devoted to Thomas More since his execution, he counted almost 150. At that time, the latest More fiction was Robert Bowles, A Man for All Seasons, and Jean Anouilh, Thomas More pour l'homme libre. Indeed, the fearless martyr, Thomas Morus, of the early Jesuit Latin plays, had become the silent, conscientious objector who was put to death following Richard Rich's perjury. In between, More had been staged as the heroic English humanist, the great Christian statesman, or the kind paterfamilias, but rarely was he a disreputable character. Never had he been represented as the unfeeling inquisitor that Hilary Mantel creates in Wolf Hall. Positioning my study from the angle of cultural history, I will try to identify the elements that signed the evolution of that representation of More. I propose to roughly follow the centuries and attempt to discover what they deemed to be the truth about Thomas More. And this is the general outline I propose, which you can also follow on your handout. 1. The age of remembrance, then of tragedy, corresponding to the 17th century. In the 18th century, a Morean eclipse. Nobody liked Thomas More very much. 19th century, the age of pathos. Oh, he was a pathetic hero. And then in the 20th century, the search for the inner man. You recognize what I will mention later. And our century, he is the Inquisitor. So the age of remembrance. I call the 6 decades that follow Thomas More's death the age of remembrance, as More was still the contemporary personage that authors or readers of the time could relate to. It seems that only in this period of his afterlife was More essentially celebrated as a humanist. For each period of time, I will give a small choice of fictional works, each being qualified by myself, like here, the saintly philosopher. In Ellis Haywood's dialogue, Il Moro, 1556, we find Sir Thomas More, a man well known for his virtue, engaging with friends in his beautiful Chelsea home in a disputation on true happiness. More is portrayed as another Socrates. So this goes with what you said, Gabriella. The moderator of a debate that unsurprisingly concludes that only virtue brings true pleasure. But the same historical character, also a humanist, is the popish fool in the Protestant morality play by William Wager. The longest thou livest, the more fool thou art, 1569. We have here a rare example of a negative representation of More in this century. Still a humanist, the author of Utopia, Mary Sir Thomas More, also appears, twice mentioned, along with his friend the grave Father Erasmus, in Thomas Nash's picaresque novel, The Unfortunate Traveller, 1594. In this age of remembrance, More is the best friend of the London poor, in the well-known play Sir Thomas More, or the Book of Sir Thomas More, by Monday, Shakespeare et al. He is the wise peacekeeping sheriff and a merciful lawyer, the merciful lawyer that we all know. All these fictions represented More as a necessary hero for the people, whatever the religious position of their authors. The London people considering him first as their special patron, rather than an icon of religious rather than an iconic religious figure. So until the first decades of the 17th century, More in fiction was essentially as the London hero, represented as the London hero and the great humanist. He would soon lose some of this familiarity to attain a more symbolic and religious value when audiences thirsted for tragedies. So we arrive at the age of tragedy, so we go through the centuries in rapid flights. Well, that's funny sometimes. The 17th century in France, especially, developed a liking and a talent for the tragedy, with Pierre Corneille in the 1640s, notably with Polyeucte, 42, a movement called Le Projet Moderne, endeavored to renovate the classical tragedy by using Christian themes rather than classical ones. It is easy to understand that the religious wars raging in France then called for religious heroes. Following Corneille, Jean Puget de la Serre wrote Thomas Morus ou Le Triomphe de la foi et de la constance, 1641. The play was extremely successful and was rapidly adapted in other languages, notably in Dutch by Glazemaker. Cardinal Richelieu was said to have been moved to tears at each time, and a few spectators died when caught in the rushing crowds. In this Thomas Morus, More is not only a martyr, but a great statesman who speaks on equal terms with his king. See this passage from Act 4, Scene 1, when Morus warns his king against tyranny. The king, do you question my power? Thomas Morus, I do not. I know its limits. King, who can limit my authority on earth? Thomas Morus, heaven. King, heaven has given me a scepter as formidable as thunder. So we recognize Louis XIV and so forth. Obviously. Thus, the religious conflict played out on stage elicits more vindictive attitudes than truly spiritual ones, as in France then, religion had become more entangled with politics. However, we must not forget one very active area of More fiction, the Latin Jesuit drama, which thrived in continental Europe since the foundation of the Jesuit order in 1540, so that's a century before, and had found in Thomas More its ideal contemporary martyr. The Jesuit plays functioned more or less as morality plays, sometimes using allegories such as madness or heresy as characters. These Latin plays featured fearless martyrs, one of whom was Thomas à Becket, to whom Morus was regularly compared, and both martyrs seem to have been alternately staged in Jesuit schools. Then the third one was Rofensis, and you recognize Fisher, John Fisher. So the three plays were alternately played on in Jesuit drama, always in Latin, of course, and thank you for Dana Sutton, who posted the translation and the Latin online, so that helped me read them. Let me just mention one anonymous Jesuit Saint Omer's play, entitled Morus, or the Integrity of Virtue Died by Its Own Blood. A good example of the heroic martyr tradition. When Morus resigns at the end of the scene of Scene 1, Henry cannot look him in the face, as he is overwhelmed by Morus' saintliness. Indeed, Morus welcomes prison and death with a joyful heart, and he is even impatient to die. How slowly the hours go by, he says. And when the death sentence is pronounced, More aside explains, I grasp the victory palm in my hand. Of course, we all know from his writing this is hardly what he said. King Henry also knows what fate awaits him. He ends the play with these words, conscious and aware, I am borne down headlong to the everlasting fires of hell. So this was played out on Jesuit stages by the students at the time. Now identified as a martyr, Thomas More was portrayed in 17th century drama as the saint par excellence, a nearly inaccessible model, emulating the figure of Christ himself. But even the ideal of sainthood evolved, and I have André Vaucher, who made a very good study of the evolution of saints throughout Christianity. So it evolved through the centuries, from the prodigious hero that we find in Middle Ages, who works miracles, to the more, and we have of course the golden legend for that, to the more familiar and closer saint, an easier model to imitate. It is precisely this tendency which is visible in our panorama of the representation of Thomas More. The age of tragedy, roughly the 17th century, had thus been the acme of More the Martyr, both in the Jesuit plays and on the professional stage, as we've seen. Before the end of the 17th century, however, one Jacopo Rossi wrote the libretto of an opera scenica entitled Tommaso Moro, to be performed at the seminary in Lucca. Lucca seemed to have been a very famous place for the Thomas More plays. Buonvisi was from Lucca, so there was a whole circle of Thomas More interested people. Turning away from the tragedy, Rossi introduces a comic character from the Commedia dell'arte, called Scarabotto, and presented as More's servant. In a way, the morality play is reactivated with two female characters called Signora Religione, who is she? Catherine of Aragon, and Signora Intemperanza, Anne Boleyn, of course, who will plot with Cromwell to provoke More's death. It's always Anne Boleyn rather than Henry VIII. I mean, the king. They don't want to make the king a devil, but they like to make Cromwell and Anne Boleyn real devils. So it's Boleyn who will provoke More's death, helped by Cromwell. A few dramatic moments are turned into comedy at the end, and at the end, Moro appears to his friend Buonvisi, who is sleeping. He appears to him as a saint in heaven floating in the clouds. And very baroque opera scenica, so it must have been sung also at times. Antonio Buonvisi, presented as the good angel of the More household, helps English Catholic exiles flee to the continent. Apparently, what he did. So this baroque play, though fantastic and frivolous, is rated as firmly rooted in historical facts by one Beatrice Corrigan, who studied Thomas More on the Italian stage, and I recommend that. So that's for the 17th century, which ends up in a baroque play. And we switch on to the 18th century, which I call the Morean eclipse. As society perhaps was turning away from religion, more secular and wary of religion, but more conscious of human rights, as we know, and the necessity for religious toleration, the martyr gradually became a conception of the past, or of a lack of interest in the martyr. Anyway, the Enlightenment with Voltaire thought of More as a barbaric man, no less. A kind of inquisitor who had lost all dignity at the scaffold when he allowed himself to joke. They did not think much of More joking on the scaffold. He just didn't know who he was, and that was really a shame. Apart from the ongoing production of Jesuit Latin plays on Thomas More, I found only 2 plays. But you may find more. Okay? Only 2 plays written and performed on 18th century stages. I must say one is at the beginning, so it could even be counted as 17th century play, and the other one is at the end, could already be a 19th century work. Anyway, 2 plays in the 18th century. One is an Italian tragedy in prose, another Tommaso Moro, by Giovanni Antonio Bianchi, published in 1724, and the other is an English closet drama by James Hurdis, Sir Thomas More, a Tragedy. And that really foreshadows what's going to happen later. Published in 1791. There seems to have been a real eclipse in More drama during more than 70 years. Interestingly, neither of these plays celebrates the martyr, but instead they stage a strong political character, someone closer to the preoccupation of the audience. Even in the Italian, if the Italian play is in the line of the earlier martyr tragedies, Bianchi placed More's dilemma as a mirror of what was taking place in Italy. He has Margherita, Margaret, declare that submission to Rome is a divine, not a human law. And Moro reminds Henry that it is difficult for the subjects to obey the prince's laws when the prince does not obey divine laws. One critic, the same Beatrice Corrigan I mentioned earlier, sees in this a barely veiled warning that Rome may relieve subjects from their duty of allegiance, with resultant danger to the king's life. The implications for the situation in Naples and Piedmont are clear, and they were both, Naples suffering from Spanish foreign rule, and Piedmont from the Savoy rule. Here, More has become a model patriot and a political agitator. The second 18th century play, Sir Thomas More Tragedy, published in England at the end of the century, was dubbed a closet drama, meant to be read but not performed on stage. And in this play, Herdis relies on pathos, appealing to the feeling of pity in the audience, in the style of literature of sensibility. And we now enter the era, with him, we enter the era of the household drama. In Herdis's closet play, More is first presented to the reader through a conversation between his friend Bonvise, same Bonvisi or Bonvisi, with his son-in-law Giles Heron. He was Cecily's husband, Cecily Moore's husband. So after the formidable martyr of the age of tragedy, the Thomas More of the 1790s and early 19th century becomes the kind father and loving husband, even the charitable neighbor, who in her display is more concerned by the ruin of others than his own family's when fire burns all the crops, as you probably know from the biography, from Roper's biography. From now on, it will be easier to discover William Roper's very words from the life of Sir Thomas More within the text of the More fiction. And from the end of the 18th century to now, we really find Roper's very words in fiction, no less in Anouilh, for example. It's even embarrassing because you think you read Anouilh and you've already read the very words first. But at least it may be true. The age of pathos we enter with the 19th century. Thomas More, as an ideal family man, will continue in fiction for a long time. The 19th century seems to me typical in two opposite ways. Fiction tends to celebrate both the family man and the martyr, again, relying on pathos and grandeur, even pomp. On the one hand, we have in France, Marc-Xavier Draparnaud, whose ambition is to write the great tragedy, a genre which he laments has disappeared. So his Thomas Moreau sous le divorce d'Henri VIII is a 5-act verse tragedy performed for the first time in 1826. Morris is praised as this worthy chancellor, the honor of England, who supports his dignity with his high virtue. He is also the austere More, the sage of Cambrai, who defends Henry's greatness. Such a great personage may talk with his king as his equal, since he obviously surpasses the sovereign in wisdom and virtue. Hence we see Henry VIII promising Norfolk that he will tame Morris's pride, but finally feeling too ashamed to speak when he faces his chancellor. Morris' speeches, with their well-balanced rhyming lines, are the kind that had the audience in tears. In one very moving speech to the magistrate, Act 3, Scene 4, Morris ends with this sentence: Les rois sont malheureux s'ils ne sont pas aimés. Well, I tend to overdo it because in France we have this Alexandrine that rhymes like the chime, really. So, translated as, kings are unhappy if they are not beloved. Then as he knows he will die a martyr, Morris exclaims, Mon plus beau jour de gloire est celui de ma mort. My most glorious day is the day of my death. And the play ends with Catherine of Aragon declaring, L'éternité couronne le martyr. Eternity crowns the martyr. Grandeur, pathos, and character simplification could easily rank the play as melodrama, a genre which proved efficient in the More fictions of that era. The history of Thomas More, offering an obvious melodramatic line. Still in France, but less grandiose, is a novel by Princesse de Cran, published in 1832, and entitled Thomas Morus, Lord Chancelier du Royaume d'Angleterre au XVIe siècle. They like long titles. The fiction pretends to be a sound historical novel. Je suis une historienne, says the lady. But I suspect there may be other anachronism than the presence of Peter Gillis at More's execution. And we know that Gillis was dead by then, had been dead for some time. But she's a historian. Faithful to the age, and she's a woman. No, I haven't said it. Faithful to the age, women weep a lot in Morris Lord Chancelier. But it's well written. I liked the play, the novel actually. It's really interesting. And however, Princesse de Cran clearly intends her novel to be a guide for the 19th century princes and politicians. And Morris religious integrity must be an example, and it's a necessary example for princes and politicians. She says at the end, in a very lively forward. A more fascinating historical fiction was published in 1851 in England by Anne Manning, you may know her. The novel is presented as Margaret's Diary, and I think that's really a fascinating work, entitled The Household of Sir Thomas More. The author seems to have captured the true atmosphere of the Chelsea home. From the time Margaret was 15 until her death, when she clasped her father's head on her bosom. This successful book went through many editions, and among which this 1896 version with illustrations by Jellicoe and Grelton. And I will show you a few illustrations. This illustrates Henry VIII's visit to Chelsea, and the diary reads, "The king was here yesterday. Will Roper, her husband, Will could not help felicitating father upon it afterwards, to which father made an answer, if my head would win him a castle in France, he should not fail to fly off." You recognize, of course, the words by William Roper. And then, here, Margaret recalls her father's fearless passage through the Traitor's Gate, entering the tower. With Manning, the kind and heroic father has no blemish, and his humor seems to always enhance his perfection. But Anne Manning is not a Catholic, and like many similar authors, she no longer defends More's religious positions, but uses her hero for the dramatic quality of his history and the model of virtue he illustrates. The 19th century was a time of extreme positions. On the one hand, anti-clericalism became more vocal in Europe, and Thomas More was seen essentially, if he was seen at all, as the author of Utopia and the father of socialism. And on the other, there was a renewed fervor in Catholic practice, devotion becoming more emotional, with a number of processions and pilgrimages on the increase, a renewed cult of the Virgin Mary. Less emphasis was placed on sin and hell. Hell was totally forgotten in the 19th century. Totally. I don't know enough, but from what I've read and through the thesis I wrote, they tried to forget about hell. But they felt a lot of empathy for the souls of purgatory, and a lot of apparitions from souls were written down and passed on, etc. Revived interest in Thomas More led to his beatification, as we know, in 1886. And this was followed by a new biography, Father Bridget's Life of Blessed Thomas More, 1891. And Thomas More's memory was revived in what is now known as the More Renaissance. With the development of psychology and psychoanalysis, authors tended to search character More in his inner recesses. This became evident all along the following 20th century. So that's why I've called the 20th century the search for the inner man. borrowing the title from Louis Mart's biography of 1990. But I think this made it true for the 20th century, in my opinion. And the early 20th century, of course, capitalizes on More's beatification. And we find two plays written by two clerics in two successive years. The first, a prose drama in 4 acts of 1930 entitled The Blessed Thomas More by Francis Bowen, and the second, the 1931 verse play by Francis Brackwell, also a Dominican, entitled Blessed Thomas More. And I've read both, and they're not bad at all. Quite interesting, yes, well written, and well. At first sight, there is a strong continuity between these plays and the earlier dramas, More being the saintly hero put to death by a wicked Henry or a devilish Cromwell whom an ambitious and calculating Anne Boleyn manipulates. However, these two Blessed Thomas More plays introduce the controversial topics of the heretics and the Maid of Kent, which had been avoided in former fiction. And I've quoted a significant passage in the handout, but I'm not showing it here. Despite the return to the martyr motif, the homely atmosphere which had appeared in the 19th century novels is now the rule, as both plays open on a scene at More's Chelsea home. Here again, the most famous sentences from Roper's life are included, and the concept of conscience seems to evolve towards a more personal understanding, foreshadowing Robert Ball's drama, as when More declares in Bowen's play, "It is not for us to judge those who have taken the oath. Each man must act according to his conscience." As for Blackwell's drama, I counted no fewer than 30 occurrences of the word conscience. So I'd say that after More's beatification, we have a revival of the martyr plays, with character More being clearly acclaimed as a saint, as is the case at the end of Blackwell's play, which is quoted in the handout, where you have these people, the common man talking to a common woman and saying, "I wish I will meet him in heaven because he's certainly a saint now." That is quite moving, actually. Before we proceed from More's beatification to his canonization in 1935, it is worth looking back. And I haven't followed the chronology because it was more interesting for thematically to do that. So we go back to, on a fascinating earlier piece of fiction, the 1912 play Thomas More, written by the Dutch poet Henriette Roland Holst. Still in the line of the household drama, this play is deemed by Unterweg the first historically exact account of events. Hero More is endowed with new qualities here. He is the solitary, resistant, unafraid of pressures, of political pressures, fighting for freedom of thought and equal rights. A model, Henriette Roland Holst. You will be the one who will be able to understand the words, the original. So Henriette Roland Holst she wished to follow herself. A model she wished to follow herself as she joined the Communist Party in opposition to her family's liberal political views. So remember, she wrote this in 1912, and then she joined the political party in 1917, of course. She wished to follow as she joined the Communist Party in opposition to her family's liberal political views. In Thomas More, the poet highlights the courageous and visionary statesman who offers peace when faced with violence. More is a utopian hero who believes in the disappearance of money and in brotherly communion. Of course, we understand Holst's position. We know that finally Roland Holst turned towards Gandhi after her disillusion with the Communist Party. She valued more peace than absence of money in society. Let us now resume the chronology. Following the peak in the Moore fiction, at his beatification in 1866, we can only expect a similar or higher peak at the canonization of 35. In the decade that followed, Unterweg counted 11 plays about the saint's life and martyrdom. 11 plays in 10 years. But now is the new saint how is the new saint portrayed? I would say that the 20th century tried to understand the psychology of a saint when staging Moore in fiction. Authors delineated a character that was brought each time closer to the common man, closer to the audience or the reader. The greatest 20th century success, Robert Bowles' A Man for All Seasons, 1960, followed 10 years later by Zinnemann's film, 1970. And now you will have photos. Managed to make Thomas Moore a man of nowadays, a model father who's close to his family and an incorruptible public man. Since Bowles, Thomas Moore mentions God in general, but never really discusses about religion, he's also acceptable to non-believers. He's simply a conscientious objector, and the audience of the 1960s and 1970s had a habit of conscientious objectors, who were respected for daring publicly disagree with the war in Algeria, for the French, or the war in Vietnam, for the Americans, and risked their freedom for that. Moore was our contemporary hero then, and many students had a photo of Moore, some students had a photo of Moore on their university dorm rooms, as they felt he was one of us, militating against war. Then came Jean Anouilh's play and film script, Thomas Moore, ou L'Homme Libre. Anouilh had written it in the early 60s, like Robert Bowles. But seeing Bowles' overwhelming success, he left it unpublished until he felt he was dying, and the play was published in 1987. Reading Anouilh's play after Robert Bowles, one feels an immediate difference in tone. Whereas Bowles Moore is a man immersed in public life, although closer to us, as I said, Anouilh's character is portrayed as the saint from the beginning. We see him in church alone in the first season, with Roper's voiceover, because it's a film script first, not a play. So you have the Roper's really life of Sir Thomas More talking over. So with Roper's voiceover, we can easily say that the play is essentially the dramatization of Roper's life and Moore's prison letters, because both Moore's prison letters and his life were translated by Pierre Léris in the same book. And of course, I think that really Jean Anouilh took the book and then made a play out of this. And well, he was a talented playwright, and so he did something very good. Never can we find any moral faults in Moore portrayed by Anouilh. He is a loving husband who confesses, "I miss my wife's reproaches," when alone in prison, and a future saint who admires Saint Cyprian and Saint Stephen, two martyrs he hopes to emulate, clearly. One fascinating aspect of Anouilh's play is the meditation on freedom. Thomas More, ou L'Homme Libre is the title. And Moore's love of inner freedom is presented poetically as a luminous quality, as if when he enters une clairière, I'm just looking for the English word, a clearing in the wood. Yes, he enters the clearing, and when he enters his prison cell, he enters a clearing, and I have found freedom here. Oh, that moves you. Yes, I liked it. And you'll find a few quotations that I've chosen, even different from what I've said here, on your handout. But so we end the 20th century with Bowles and Anouilh, where the inner man has become the subject of fiction. The reader or spectator is moved by Moore's doubts. He has doubts here, he's not the fearless martyr, and difficult choices. We are very far from the fearless rebel who lectured his sovereign and rushed to martyrdom with a vengeance. And let's quit the 20th century to enter our century now. The 20th century, which has portrayed More as an inquisitor. Of course, it sounds artificial to see an ongoing process change precisely when a new century opens, and of course this is not the case. However, it seems convenient and interesting for the study to note that John Guy's 2000 essay, Thomas More, marked a turning point, leading to a different representation of England's Chancellor in fiction. He is a historian, but he had us write different fiction after his study. With his 10 chapters presented as 10 questions, the historian was reviewing most received assertions concerning More. And perhaps it was to be expected that a talented novelist would precisely revel in inverting roles. Thomas Cromwell had been the villain in most fictions, he was going to be the new hero. Thomas More had been the saint, he was going to be the villain. This is what happened with Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, which appeared in 2009 and was awarded the Booker Prize. Mantel's curt and efficient style makes everything sound true, and Cromwell is portrayed as a talented self-made politician who had had enough courage and intelligence to survive a harsh childhood and the early death of his wife. Mantel's Cromwell is admirable in his enduring resistance to humiliation and devotion to his masters, be they Cardinal Wolsey or the king himself. So now let's compare the film's picture with Holbein's portrait. Well, Holbein saw the real man, but we have fiction. Near him, Sir Thomas More is the privileged bourgeois and the unkempt person. Some sort of failed priest, I quote, or frustrated preacher, who should have been a monk instead of lecturing and shaming people. Mantel's Thomas More has no humor, but only a talent for pranks, jokes, which More uses, writes Mantel, to mock and embarrass people. So let's compare the film's picture with Holbein's portrait. More is hardly anything else than an inquisitor, a hypocrite and a sad moralist. Even when one of Mantel's characters visits More's house and meets More's fool, the merry Henry Pattinson, the visitor questions the truth of it all. Is he really simple? There is something sly in More. He enjoys embarrassing people. It would be like him to have a fool that wasn't. In Michael Hurst, so that's all for Mantel. In Michael Hurst's TV series The Tudors, so very Hollywood-like. Yes. Of course, Henry VIII is always thin and good-looking and so forth. Sir Thomas More is also a somber character who turns an inquisitor and is seen rejoicing at the burning of heretics at the stake. How explain this negative 21st century judgment of More? I think this would be an ideal topic for discussion. Is it linked to the decline of religion in our Western societies? To the threat of Islamist terrorism? To the perception of the martyr, understood as a fanatic now by the man of the street? Or to our current belief in relativity rather than truth? Well, I don't think there is one final answer. I'm not the one to give one final answer, but there is more food for thought. And I will conclude that history's judgment of Thomas More, as I have tried to show rapidly, has followed each century's expectations and common beliefs. More has always made an ideal, fictional character, and his life history a perfect source of drama. No wonder More has been used diversely to suit contemporary needs, being the champion of a cause, or the desired model of a particular era, from the humanist and London patron to the martyr, the political agitator, or fantastic paterfamilias, to the sad writer of wrongs. The relentless pendulum of history has looked for new heroes in some neglected characters of the past, like it's doing today, More's utopia, on the other hand, has never been so much studied and so much admired. And Thomas More has become a literary champion in the 21st century. Literary champion. As we just have to wait a few decades to see a different champion called Thomas More appear in tomorrow's new fiction.